Back to the book. Towards evening, I posted upon a rising ground amongst a clump of tall trees. There seemed to have been a sharp skirmish here, as 3 Frenchmen were lying dead amongst the long grass upon the spot where I was standing. As I threw my rifle to my shoulder and walked past them on my beat, I observed they had been plundered, and their haversacks having been torn off, some of the contents were scattered about. War is a sad blunter of the feelings, I have often thought since those days. The contemplation of 3 ghastly bodies in this lonely spot failed then in making the slightest impression upon me. The sight had become, even in the short time I had been engaged in the trade, but too familiar. And now another truce kind of happens, and he's observing the scene in this churchyard. The scene in this churchyard was somewhat singular. 2 long tables had been procured from some houses near and were placed end to end amongst the graves, and upon them were laid the men whose limbs it was found necessary to amputate. Both French and English were constantly lifted on and off these tables. As soon as the operation was performed upon one lot, they were carried off, and in those waiting behind were hoisted up. The surgeons with their sleeves turned up and their hands and arms covered in blood, looking like butchers in the shambles. I saw as I passed at least 20 legs lying on the ground, many of them being clothed in the long black gaiters then worn by the infantry line. The surgeons had plenty of work on hand that day, and not having the time to take the clothes off the wounded, they merely ripped the seams and turned the cloth back, proceeding with the operation as fast as they could. Many of the wounded came straggling into this churchyard in search of assistance by themselves. I saw one man, faint with loss of blood, staggering along, and turned to assist him. He was severely wounded in the head, his face being completely encrusted with blood, which had flowing during the night now dried. One eyeball was knocked out of the socket and hung down upon his cheek. Another man I observed who had been brought in and propped up against a grave mound. He seemed very badly hurt. The men who had carried him into the churchyard had placed his cap filled with the fragments of biscuit close beside his head, and he lay and occasionally turned his mouth towards it, got a hold of a piece of biscuit, and munched it. As I was about to leave the churchyard, Dr. Ridgway, one of the surgeons, called me back to assist with holding a man he was endeavoring to operate upon. "Come and help me with this man," he said, "or I shall be all day cutting a ball out of his shoulder." The patient's name was Doubter, an Irishman. He disliked the doctor's efforts and writhed and twisted so much during the operation that it was with difficulty Dr. Ridgway could perform it. He found it necessary to cut very deep, and Doubter made a terrible outcry at every fresh incision. "Oh, doctor, dear doctor," he said, "it's murdering me you are. Blood and hounds, I shall die, I shall die. For the love of the Lord, don't cut me all to pieces." Doubter was not altogether wrong, for although he survived the operation, he died shortly thereafter from the effects of his wounds. Again, you just got surgeons mixing blood and not clean and not even cutting off clothes or sterilizing. I mean, the amount of people that must have lost from infections after the fact is just crazy.